You know, David, it would seem that throughout history, there have occasionally been these rogue players in the FBI and elsewhere. Today, we're going to continue the exploration into the activities of one individual who possibly fits that description. And you've been speaking about for years. I'm talking about Oliver Buck Revell. David, welcome back to the show. How are you feeling today?
Very good, Jason. It'll be, I think, extremely interesting for this, what we discover on this show.
I think you're right, David, because, you know, a lot of people who are perhaps new to David Hawkins' Discovery CSI and may not realize that you and I are doing a sponsor-exclusive show each week on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. Some of the people who aren't yet sponsors or haven't been watching you for years and years, they might not have heard of this guy, Oliver Buck Revell. Before we talk about how his activities could have enabled, inspired, allowed state capture, and I know you're going to explain to us exactly what that is, can you give us a little background on Oliver Buck Revell and why someone so important has been able to remain in the shadows for so long?
Well, I think he's availing himself of a virtual private network to stay behind the curtains, but I'll come to that in a minute. But he first pops up with a high profile in December of 1988, when he rushes onto the tarmac at Heathrow Airport and takes his son and daughter-in-law off. They were about to board Pan Am 103, which was about to be blown up over Lockerbie. Now, I don't know if I fully understand what serendipity it is, but this is not an example. This is an anomaly where somehow someone communicated to Oliver Buck Revell it would be a good idea to get his son and daughter-in-law off that plane and save their lives, of course. So there's a huge question mark. And as you know, when I do or try and share with others my crime scene investigation technique, which often goes delving into the patent office to see if there's any patents that leave a signature at the crime scene consistent with what we see, then they would know that I always look for an anomaly. That is to say, we listen to the government's account of that, or actually in this particular case, the lack of account. No government agency, as far as I'm aware, has pointed out, including the National Crime Agency in the UK or Boeing Aircraft, the anomaly of a guy who's a senior cop, FBI, a G-man, I guess, right, rushing onto the tarmac and taking his son. That is to say, he has foreknowledge. Now, going back, that was 1988. Let's go back to what he was doing, Oliver Buck Revell, in 1975. He was the senior FBI investigator of the Weather Underground organization in Chicago and Philadelphia. And when we're talking about state capture, obviously we're talking about, in the case of the Weather Underground, their objective to overthrow the government of the United States by force.
Now, let me pause you there, David, because the Weather Underground is so important, and I knew nothing about it at all until you told me about it. And as I attempt to discuss it with people, I find that there are still many people who are totally unaware of what the Weather Underground is, what they do, how it pertains to Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and everything that's happening right now. Let's just briefly, quickly remind people who are perhaps joining us for the first time what the Weather Underground was, is, and sought to do.
Well, it grew out of the Students for a Democratic Society, where someone called the Kid apparently told various authorities that BIC in New York had offered to fund riots and revolutionary movements, etc., in Chicago in the 1968 Days of Rage. So, of course, all of these organizations, they don't pop out of nowhere. There's a long cultural tradition that goes back, I believe, to the United Kingdom, that of actually having a paid revolutionary movement to infiltrate, and that's a key word per that JFK speech of 1961, that these people, that is to say, America and the Five Eyes countries, or the free world, face a ruthless and monolithic conspiracy that uses infiltration instead of invasions, and guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. And with these Weather Underground people, you've got exactly that. You've got, I would say, psychologically damaged, if not psychopathic individuals who have been cut away from society for whatever reason, maybe child abuse, maybe bribery, maybe ideological mind, MLK type, MK Ultra type movements. These people believe in revolution. When I think Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers were asked about how they would protect their revolution by an FBI informer or insider, he was told, I think it was Larry Growell or something like that, he was told that they would probably have to have 25 million Americans killed to protect the revolution. And I'm saying, when an organization like that disappears, does it really disappear? Has it been dismantled? Absolutely not.
Well, that's just it. That's the key question, isn't it, David? Because we're just looking right now briefly at this article from Time magazine. You should remember, this is the same magazine that ran the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald standing in the backyard, allegedly holding the rifle that was used to assassinate John F. Kennedy, effectively trying and convicting him in the court of public opinion. They have this story about how the Weather Underground failed at their revolution and still changed the world. But it's interesting to also note, I don't know if you got to see this article from the frequently derided New York Post. They sometimes give us some factual reporting. Here we hear that the judge compared these bomb-throwing lawyers to Weather Underground radicals. So it's good to know, at least, that federal judges here in the Southern District of New York compared them and is aware of the activities. This is Judge Gerald Lynch made the comparison as attorneys for accused bomb throwers Collinford Mattis and Rouge argued for their clients to be released on bail to a 3-judge panel. What do you think about this, David?
Well, this is consistent with creating what I believe are underground criminal organizations, giving them the label terrorism, which I think the left and the academics love to use because that shields them from this analysis of Marxist-Leninism, where if you do analyze it, and I don't spend a great deal of time, it's basically an extortion racket, right? And these people, they offer protection to communities and cities and provinces and states, provided they get paid, right? And then they have a particular range of ways of intimidating the public into accepting the idea of a tax or protection money or concessions. So what you've got here is these guys throw bombs, but we don't know who pays them to throw bombs, who builds the bombs, what is the network behind it. And particularly when you have evidence, as I see all around us today, of synchronization and coordination, you need what is called a command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance system, right, to keep all of these people moving together through the crime scene at the right time. You don't want the bomb throwers arrive too early before you've got a rent-a-crowd in position. You know, like you don't want to have George Floyd murdered or killed without having an appropriate crowd around him.
With the cameras rolling
and all that. With the cameras and rolling, and the link straight into the mainstream media. So that image can be sent, for example, I believe the BBC is the principal vehicle for transporting this propaganda. You want, in the case of the BBC, within a week, you've got those images in front of an audience of 500 million people in 50 languages, right? Now that is serious stuff. So coming back to, you know, George Orwell's night, I believe the first and most articulate expression of state capture through a combination of torture and tracking of citizens and looking at their face expression is George Orwell's book that was published in 1949, 1984. But George Orwell wrote that book partly based on his experience when he was working with the BBC in Room 101, which is where allegedly the superficial explanation is this was the place where he had to listen to interminable meetings and he was very boring. But Room 101 in the fiction is a much more exciting place, right? Because it's where you attempt to break the bonds, let's say between mother and son or father and brother, etc., to see if you can break down the bonds that tie human beings together in their social networks with love and compassion and empathy and trying to do the best for your fellow human being. and see if you can break those bonds and turn it into unquestioning loyalty to Big Brother or the state. And we've now reached this stage today and you can see it. Now, Room 101 has a particularly, and I don't want to have this vetted or vetoed, but there's a particular method of torture in Room 101. And you stop me if you think this is going to shock people and they don't want to hear it. But the idea was with Winston, who was the friend of Julia, I think her name was, and they loved each other, as best I can understand. And Winston had a phobia about rats. So the idea of Room 101 torture is to get someone addressed with their phobia so that they beg for the torturer to stop the torture and transfer the torture to the person they love. So if you go through that process, of course, you end up by betraying, as Winston did, his girlfriend, Julia. And he believes that Julia was tortured in a similar way, such that she betrayed him. He noticed a mark on her forehead. I don't know. It didn't go into details about how she was tortured. But you and I were in London, and this is an epic journey. People will look back at that documentary, and I think they'll be amazed, because we did some interesting things. We looked at the George Orwell statue outside Broadcasting House. We asked if we could go to Room 101, right? We tried to get into the main foyer. We weren't allowed in. We went across to the Langham Hotel, where the news of the Abraham Lincoln assassination first reached the UK. It was a really epochal, I think, story that we told. And then we got some very important symbols. We looked at the statue outside the BBC with the Obsculta message carved on the book.
It's so difficult to keep up, David. Hang on a second. I mean, let me just remind people that they can see. We're obviously just looking on Google Earth right now, but they can join us on that journey where we went just in January to London, something that seems like as distant as Mars now. I don't know if you could even go to London, but people can enjoy that by looking at the sponsor-exclusive shows on Patreon and Subscribestar. And of course, you're talking, David, about this bizarre artwork that is outside the BBC, created by this guy, Eric Gill. The Obsculta sculpture, it's something that we've talked about quite a bit, and I've been introducing to other guests as well. I think this is so important, David. Can you remind us just for a moment what this is all about?
Yes, well, people can draw their own conclusions about the sexual nature of this naked young man or even boy in the pose of a crucifixion, serenaded by two angels, and the book that is being held underneath him has got this message, Obsculta. Right? Now, this is the BBC. This was carved in 1934, right? And Obsculta is apparently the first word, hat tip to one of our listeners who told us. Obsculta is the first word of the Benedictine Creed, listen and obey, right? Now, I'm going to bring you straight back to Oliver Buck Revell, because now I want you to flip to the Vancouver Mural, right? I want people to remember in their heads what this image is like, you know, the winged creatures, right? And the posture of the youth up on possibly a crucifix. He's obviously being tortured, and something is being offered to him, I think, where perhaps he could get off the crucifix if he listened and obeyed. But for the time being, he isn't, right? Now, this is a statue that I believe projects what the BBC stands for, or has come to stand for, since 1934, if not to the day it was founded. That is to say, it's broadcasting propaganda, right, to 500 million people a week in 50 languages that describes all of these events through the lens of state capture, in my opinion. That is to say, they want the world to believe that America is ruled by elitist, racist white people. Notwithstanding, in the case of George Floyd, they knew each other.
Wait, David, have we explained to everyone what state capture is? Because that's a very specific term, and I think it's important to the conversation today that we're going to be having later.
Yes, absolutely. Well, state capture is where the organs of the state, the justice system, the welfare system, the tax system, are subverted and infiltrated by private interests to maximize their power, their control, or their wealth. And when we look at the technology required for state capture, we find the damn Brits have been there a long, long time ago, because the perfect instrument or technology or network for state capture is what in World War II was called the Combined Communications Electronics Board, that was launched in 1941, I believe, to bring together the propaganda arm of the Americans through Elmer Davis, right, who became the head of the Information War Office, if that's the
Where
right
Bill
term.
de Blasio's mother, Maria de Blasio, worked.
Absolutely, and there are no coincidences, because for me, this was the inner party, right, of the United Kingdom and the United States, as defined through the Rhodes Scholarship and Cecil Rhodes' 200-year plan, to bring together the Anglo-Saxon race, if you will, to control and dominate the world. I think he left a little gap for the Germans. I never quite understood why. And, you know, fairly obviously, I've got a name like Hawkins, and I guess I'm Anglo-Saxon, so I can apologize for that. But what intrigues me is the success of this operation, because it's now over 100 years old. So he's well on the way towards his 200-year goal of complete domination of what in the book, the George Orwell book, would be called the inner party of Oceania, right?
Now, this CCOB, this thing, it is
EB.
somehow, sorry, tell us what that is. It somehow appears on the Federal Bridge somewhere, doesn't it?
Yes, it's down on the bottom left at about 7 o'clock, right?
Let's remind people what this Federal Bridge is all about. Not that you
Okay.
and I necessarily fully understand it, but it's an interesting diagram, and the more we've asked questions about it, the more we've come under direct attack. And sorry, before you go into the details, David, I noticed that reverse CSI scripts seems to be once again, you know, there's all these cyber attacks going on, David, but I wanted to invite people to visit your free website, reversecciscripts.com, where they can reach your Patreon links and see that map and download your free vector analysis. But it appears that something's gone wrong.
Oh, okay. Well, this account has been suspended.
It's amazing, isn't it? There's a lot of that going on, David. It happened to me with Twitter, with Periscope, shenanigans on Facebook. I wonder if this is all coincidental, or if someone is agitating, trying to prevent you and I from discussing this.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a surprise to me. But just carrying on. So if we look at that Federal Bridge, it's got some very interesting aspects to it. Down on the bottom left, and I'm just losing the image at the moment. Let me see what's happened here.
Looks like it should be there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, now I'm doing it from memory because I don't have the screen in front of me for some reason. It's just it's dropped off, but I'm sure it's there because I can hear your voice. So down on the bottom left, you'll see that CCEB with the Ministry of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
Have you got that?
Yes.
Okay. So CCEB was launched in 1941, and it's the Combined Communications Electronics Board, right, that would allow the United States and the United Kingdom to launch these double cross operations, such as, for example, I believe, Pearl Harbor, or Operation Mincemeat later in the war, or Operation Bodyguard. What's happening there is they plant double agents inside the enemy's intelligence gathering network, and they control those double agents, right? And such that the double agents are obliged to stay loyal in their double agent status. If they go to triple agent, they may be exposed as pedophiles, they may be threatened, their family, etc., might be destroyed. So if you move that technology into the proof of concept in Vancouver, I want to come back to Oliver Buck Revell. Oliver Buck Revell, he left the FBI in 1994, and then, I believe, aided and abetted by a man called Yves Fortier, right, who was a Rhodes Scholar of 1958. He set up a business in West Georgia Street in Vancouver called Imagist Technologies. And Imagist Technologies specializes in facial recognition software and sells facial recognition software services to, and this is where I think it becomes really sinister, to welfare agents, tax agents, and police agents, first of all in the Vancouver downtown east side area, right? And ultimately to cities and provinces and states and around the world. So it's a
David,
major...
let me ask you this. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
Is it fair for us to presume, or is there any way for us to get some more information about the possibility that Imagus Technologies has somehow licensed or otherwise been involved? Can you see the screen share? This UK and Australia open joint data privacy investigation into Clearview AI?
Yes, I can see that. What's happened is once you open the door to a root key access to the federal bridge, you control the bridge. You control every transaction. You can synchronize a series of attacks, for example, the attack on George Floyd, such that what goes out on the internet, right, or worldwide, is the impression that a white racist cop killed or murdered a George Floyd, a black guy. But what is not presented, what is withheld, is the fact that these people knew each other, right? What people may not understand is that he was deemed to be COVID positive, right? Now that may mean nothing, but if we go back to that Federal Bridge image, it may mean a great deal, because if, for example, this virus is being spread by asymptomatic carriers that are being coordinated through the Federal Bridge and virtual private networks on the Federal Bridge, then the spread of the COVID virus may be, so to speak, man-made, malice aforethought. So you can close down New York City, which is what these brain-dead people like Bill de Blasio and Cuomo, they're actually doing.
Now, so David, did you get a chance, along the lines of what you're saying, I agree that that's what they're doing. And I want to just make a few connections for people real quick, because there's been some recent news about this woman, Susan Rosenberg, who is on the board of a thing called Thousand Currents, which handles a lot of the charitable donations that are made to Black Lives Matter. It's a very convoluted route as far as how the money gets there. And Bill de Blasio, as we are discussing, is actually Warren Wilhelm Jr. And yesterday, David, this has got to be one of the most antagonistic things I have ever heard of any adult doing to another adult. It's fine for Bill de Blasio to support Black Lives Matter, but what he chose to do was to not only have the city paint a giant Black Lives Matter logo, or however we want to call it, right in front of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. He actually went there and participated in the painting himself. I went there last night as soon as I was able to get there. Oh, the naked cowboy is there. I didn't see him. And basically what they've done, David, is they've stood down the NYPD. Normally when I go by Trump Tower, there is a very well-armed and substantial police presence there. There were virtually none yesterday. So in my view, it seems that Bill de Blasio deliberately had this done so that he could taunt President Trump and other people who might be at Trump Tower. And by standing down the police, it's certainly suggestive to me that he was hopeful that some incident would arise that could then be injected into international news, showing unrest right in front of Trump Tower, which, as far as New York City buildings go, is essentially the personification of President Trump. I don't understand why Bill de Blasio wouldn't have directed this, whatever we want to call it, mural, logo. They could have painted it in front of City Hall, where he's already basically relinquished this ground to an anarchist mob of, vagrants who are occupying the space where the cops are also doing nothing. Seems very provocative to me, David.
Yeah, well, he's listening and he's obeying. He's been told to do it, right? It's not that coming out of his brain. The organization behind him, and here's, I think, where we have to talk about state capture and the specific example of Vancouver. When I was working for Schlumberger, traveling around the world, I was working 3 years in Paris, and my job then, this is sort of, I think, 1977, whatever, was to take an idea out of research as a proof of concept, move it through development engineering to produce a small pilot system, let's say 10 pieces of equipment that would go to different parts of the world, go to the field and check how this equipment is being used effectively and what its weaknesses and strengths are.
Sounds like ground truthing, David.
You got it. And go back to engineering to modify and try and remove most of the flaws. Actually, it was a fascinating job. I applied exactly the same techniques when I was working in artificial intelligence in the 1980s for the development of geoscene. Now, fast forward to the present. Maybe I asked you if you could show that Lockheed Martin C4ISR image, right? Which allows, let's say, the bad guys to look at, yes, this is it. Now, if you can, I don't know if we don't know, no, we don't need to blow that up. But this is an image of what they probably call nowadays a cockpit or a dashboard for global surveillance, right? All around the world, where you can zoom into an area like Vancouver or New York and build a Blasio's antics outside Trump Tower, right? Where he's been told, we want you to go and paint Black Lives Matter on the road. Now, that is an expression of a sloganeering, if you will, that is meant to convey to the outside world, again, back through the BBC, to an audience of 500 million people in 50 languages, that the United States is ready for a revolution.
Right.
Where the one slogan that's important is Black Lives Matter. Now, I went back through the George Orwell Canton, is it whatever it is, the word I'm missing there. And apparently he commits or talks about a face crime. That is to say, if you wear an inappropriate expression when everyone's jumping up and down and saying Black Lives Matter, you are deemed to be a threat to the inner party of Oceania, right? So you should be, or could be, hauled into room 101 for a little bit of torture to make sure that you are bonded to the right kind of people and that you've broken your bonds to the wrong kind of people, as far as they're concerned.
You know, it's funny, David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this gentleman I was speaking to outside Trump Tower yesterday, I didn't agree with everything that he had to say, but we were able to have a nice conversation, and he was generally a sensible guy. He spoke about how it was almost torture for him to stay home because he was so bored and so isolated. I think he might have even used the word torture. And of course, he's wearing a mask. Okay, so go, if you will, to an image of the room 101 rat cage. I'm sure there's dozens of them that you can find. But I found in my last post a particularly graphic example of that I think was brilliantly drawn. And then we have a picture, remember, of the Israel Aircraft Industries coronavirus surveillance system at the hospital. And just imagine you're either strapped with a mask on your face that's got rats in it, right, which must be truly terrifying. You're helpless, you're probably strapped into this chair, and you can prevent the torture on yourself if you betray someone else. And of course, by betraying someone else and possibly having them in a different room 101 betraying you, you can break the bond. This was the brilliant perception of George Orwell between, let's say, members of the same family, or lovers, or mothers or children, or fathers or brothers. And now let's look at the individual. Yes, I think that's particularly graphic and powerful drawing. That's why I love working with you, because you have this gift of illumination. I can investigate and you can illuminate, right? but let's just touch on that. The image is so much more powerful, right, than any words I have. I mean, you can imagine yourself. I can imagine myself a rat, I've got a nice dinner in front of me. Or I can imagine myself the guy strapped inside the cage, absolutely helpless, absolutely terrifying, ready to betray the people you love to stop what is your ultimate phobia. Now move that into lying in bed, let's say Boris Johnson. I don't know if you can pull up that other picture of the Israel Aircraft Industries and the surveillance of the coronavirus. You've got a dashboard, a template, or a cockpit image where you're looking at someone who's lying in bed with presumably a ventilator on their face,
right, where the ventilator signals can be controlled remotely, and you can be killed and actually suffocated or asphyxiated by remote control through what has been developed by Serco for Israel Aircraft Industries.
That's the Trump usability thing?
Yes, yes. The Lloyd's Register and Her Majesty's Revenues and Customs. Now that I believe was an interface that is the equivalent to the Combined Communications Electronics Board. I'm talking about the Trump project that was launched at the National Physical Laboratory in 1990. That's the virtual private network interface to the Federal Bridge. Now what that means is I can capture the state if I can align enough private interests like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, State of Illinois, Veterans Affairs, and the Department of Justice to embark on a program of state capture where the American public is totally oblivious to what is going on inside that network. Yeah, so if you zoom in and over on the left, right, and this is very much relevant to what you're facing, I believe now, you can see a cluster of 3 entities on the Federal Bridge: the State of Illinois, the Department of Justice, and Veterans Affairs. Now, you and I are both being attacked continuously, I believe, by vets, right? And I'd like to think that Marine Corps vets obey a different order of integrity, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that they all are probably extremely capable in an emergency. They're extremely well trained, right? But not all of them, right? And some of them can be caught up in what I believe are the principal methods of extortion that weren't invented, but perhaps were perfected by Bernardine Dohrn back in the 1970s when she was being monitored, I believe, by Oliver Buck Revell. And
let's give people some background on that, because this is where it all sort of comes together. Bernardine Dohrn, of course, was one of the principals of the Weather Underground. And what do you want to tell us about Bernardine Dohrn?
Well, she went to Northwestern University and she held seminars, Torture, Paradigms, and Practice.
She taught at Northwestern University. Didn't she go to Chicago University and also Ohio, Miami University in Ohio? Did you know that George Webb also went to Miami University in Ohio, as did Joe Napoli? Do you think there's any possibility that alumni would mingle?
Totally, because going back to the facial recognition software that I believe, I don't know if it was stolen or taken by Oliver Buck Revell from the FBI, but obviously the FBI would be using tracking systems to track its investigators and the suspects. And that's where, you remember, JABS comes in, the Joint Automated Booking System that was built by Nortel Government Solutions, of which one of the directors was a guy called Yves Fortier. It was built for the Department of Justice to track prisoners and their guards through incarceration, trial, maybe export, where you send the people out of state or out of the country. So Oliver Buck Revell would be very familiar with the technology of joint automated booking systems. And this would allow him to track the Weather Underground principles. The director of Nortel that built JABS for the Department of Justice that I'm interested in is the Rhodes Scholar from 1958, Yves Fortier, who was a Montreal-based lawyer during and after the Kennedy assassination. Yeah. Where those 3 guys, including Clay and Ferrier and the guy's name, for whatever reason I always forget, Rocco or Rico, it wasn't Jack Ruby, chartered a plane and flew up to Montreal, and I believe got their marching orders to organize the assassination of JFK. Earlier that year, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was seen in Montreal with a hands-off Cuba procession or, protest meeting, etc.
Yeah, fair play for Cuba committee.
Yeah, Oliver Buck, what's his name? Lee Harvey Oswald is a Marine.
That's true.
And he had an honorable discharge. But he was the patsy, it would appear, to be set up as the lone killer of JFK. However, even someone without any ballistics training, I just happen to be an engineer, You can look at the Zapruder film of the JFK assassination. There appear to be a couple of impacts that push him forward, but the last impact of a bullet blows his head backwards. The principle of conservation of momentum means that bullet had to come from in front, most probably from James E. Files on the grassy knoll, right? So what we've got here is an illusion, a piece of magic, a piece of propaganda that is generally then propagated through the BBC, which has documented extensively the JFK assassination, as it did the George Floyd murder, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? The 7/7 underground bombing. Every time I see the BBC generating a story to be fed to the public, I start looking for anomalies. Oh, that's it. Let me just jump straight back to that. So if Oliver Buck Revell has perfected this facial recognition software, wouldn't it make a superb tool to terrify people a la Room 101? That is to say, you follow...
How would it do that, David?
Well, let's say your mother, your father, your brother, your sister catches this COVID-19. No one really understands to you the mechanics of the transfer, but then they go into hospital, as did Boris Johnson, and he just missed being put on a ventilator, right? Now, what you see there are the vital signs of a remote control system that I call the Trump interface or Trump usability system that could be used to play with the signals that go to the ventilator of that individual. And that individual could be a relative of yours, or it could be you. Now, how terrifying would it be to know that if you don't cancel, if you go ahead with your claim you want to cancel the BBC license fees, if they tell you, we're going to put you on a ventilator and you're not going to come out of it alive, and you're going to die a horrible slow death because maybe we'll feed the right amount of oxygen, then we'll back off. So you've got a Room 101 potential with the Trump interface to the Federal Bridge that's probably just as terrifying as having a mask strapped to your face with rats in it. Right?
Now, David, I want to share something very important with you, because we've spoken quite a lot about this mandatory TV license in the United Kingdom and how Boris Johnson had proposed eliminating it. And I've been asking you each week since Boris Johnson was released from hospital, to say it the British way, what's going on with this. And it seems that it's been not only walked back, but just yesterday, BBC was announcing that they're going to go ahead and force people over 75 to get them, which I understand used to be not the case. So it seems like now they're forcing more people to have these licenses. And also, over 75, those are individuals who are at greater risk, according to the propaganda we've heard, of
that means more than 3 million households will be asked to start paying the 157.50 fee from the 1st of August. This, Jason, is extortion.
Yes.
Right? And what I believe or claim, it is a result of Boris Johnson being navigated through St. Thomas Hospital, where the pathology lab is run by a Serco subsidiary called Viapath. And he was told, I believe, I can't prove it, if you proceed with this, Boris, you're not going to get out of here alive. And you're going to die a very horrible, slow death with upper respiratory disorders, because we remotely, that is to say, someone in Vancouver, could play with the signals that drive the ventilator, potentially strapped to Boris Johnson's face.
And David, wouldn't you also say that it's going to assist the BBC in further extorting those over 75 and causing them to fear coronavirus and all the other nonsense that the BBC wants to propagandize people with?
Yes. So this is state capture, right? And let me just come back to Vancouver and the downtown east side. Going back to my earlier comment about introducing technology into the field, first of all, you need what is called a proof of concept that your system works. I believe Vancouver and the downtown east side was a proof of concept for what would ultimately lead to state capture of the Five Eyes countries, which is what you're looking at right now. Now, what happened in the downtown east side, I think through corruption and infiltration of welfare agencies, Oliver Buck Revell was able to track vulnerable women and children through the downtown east side and see which one of them could be disappeared or abducted and no one would notice. That is to say, in order to do that, you need to be monitoring or tracking the police, because within the Vancouver Police Department or the RCMP, you will have corrupt cops, like you do in Chicago, like you do in New York, and you will have good cops, right? So you need to make sure that
Sorry, David, what about the ability to stand the police down? Then it doesn't matter if
Absolutely.
they're corrupt. You just take them out of business.
Or if you want a corrupt cop close to the crime scene to give fake evidence, right? Or remove evidence. And this is what happened with the raid on Starnet of the 20th of August of 1999. I believe by then it had proved itself as a potential tool for state capture. That is to say, the Starnet kit that was confiscated apparently contained images of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming. Now,
well, David, who is in custody right now who is also allegedly involved in blackmail and torture and rape and all that? None other than
Ghislaine Maxwell.
Right.
You got it. So I believe what the BBC, going back to 1934, with that listen and obey mantra, is that it's found a number of ways, its handlers, which include the government, the British government, of course, because it's a crown corporation, have found a number of ways that would be very consistent with George Orwell's 1984 of state capture, really without going to war head to head, right? No one really wants to go to war head to head with the United States, except on 9/11, when allegedly we're supposed to believe that a long-bearded jerk straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan decided to go to war with the United States. And the propaganda is so efficient that most Americans now believe Osama bin Laden attacked America on 9/11. But when you look at the strategic targets, you can see, I believe, the agenda of state capture. That is to say, its financial hub, if you will, in the World Trade Centers were demolished, right? Its military hub at the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center was destroyed and 125 people killed. But for that last plane leaving late, 41 minutes late, it would have hit the Capitol building at the same time as the US Pentagon Navy Command Center was hit.
I think it's also important, David, that we remind people about this New York Times article from September 11th, 2001, in which Bill Ayers, literally on the morning of September 11th, he says he has no regrets for his love of explosives and he wishes he had done more. I think that this is a clear indication, just like Oliver Buck Revell running out on the tarmac, this is a message. He's got foreknowledge of what's going on. They didn't do enough. So now today, September 11th, 2001, he's sending a message, and look at the smile on these two, sending a message that they're about to do more in an attempt at state capture, right?
Right. So now, here's what I believe the public can do. There was a raid on Starnet where they took away 3 floors worth of images, files, computers, disks, etc., for an organization that over 4 years had built a global business in 60 countries in hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming. And I believe that's online gaming is a euphemism for Deadpool betting. And just if people don't know what Deadpool betting is, it's basically where a broker or a bookie, maybe William Hill, whose director includes Roy Gardner, who's the chairman of Serco, has a sports book. And incidentally, Americans should understand that William Hill now is the biggest sports book operator in Nevada. Well, that's kind of interesting, given that William Hill is a British company, given that the director of William Hill is Roy Gardner, who's the chairman of Serco, where Serco has the contract to track COVID people or COVID suspects on the Isle of Wight prior to rolling out a global tracking system that I believe will use Oliver Buck Revell's face recognition software to track global coronavirus suspects around the world, where they can be periodically dragged into a re-education camp, right? Or into a hospital with bars on the outside and strapped into a gurney, right, where they're administered a vaccine or a chip. And if they argue, they are not listening and obeying the Rhodes Scholarship and Rothschild network, and therefore they must be disposed of. And I think the experiment to prove the concept was developed in the downtown east side of Vancouver, aided and abetted by two offices on West Georgia Street, one which is the Office of Images Technologies, founded by Oliver Buck Revell, the guy who went onto the tarmac and took his son and daughter-in-law before they got onto Pan Am 103. And the next building is 1055 in West Georgia Street, where one of the offices was held by a CAI private equity group, CAI standing for Canadian American Investors Private Equity Group, which has some very interesting investors, 50 of them, including Yves Fortier, the 1958 Rhodes Scholar, who I believe met with Ferrier, Clay, and the other guy whose name I never remember in Montreal to finance the assassination of JFK and set up Lee Harvey Oswald as the patsy.
Now, David, is this the same thing, CAI Capital Partners?
Yes.
So where does it say who the investors are?
I've been investigating these people since 2004. You used to be able to get it on their website. I think that's now disappeared, so you can't find it. But I've got 2 volumes of where I did the research back in 2004. But anyway, there are 50 investors, but the important things, I believe, are 2, well, 3 maybe. David Johnson, who's the former Governor General of Canada, Yves Fortier, right, who's the lawyer in Montreal that I believe met with the assassins organizing the death of JFK, right, and a very important guy by the name of General Alexander Haig, who is now dead. The reason why General Alexander Haig is dead, well, the reason why he's so important is being the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he would have the military skills and military ability to structure the 9/11 attack such that it looked like Osama bin Laden, and actually concealed a network of Rhodes scholars, and including Bill Clinton and Susan Rice and a guy called Bruce Reed. That is to say, it was a criminal attack on 9/11. The objective was state capture, right? It nearly succeeded. In fact, if that 4th plane had left on time and taken out the Capitol building with all of the senators and congressmen inside, I believe it would have succeeded in state capture.
Sorry, David, I've seemed to have located a CAI private equity investors webpage from February 2003. And perhaps we can find some investment professionals, special investors. That seems like that might be what we're
Those are the ones, yeah. Those are the ones. Oh, there we are. They got the name. If you can blow that up, right? And you'll see the important one there is Yves Fortier, QC. You see that?
There he is.
And General Alexander Haig.
Oh, there he is. So would this have been the thing that it created, like AOL, or what was it? Didn't Alexander Haig have something to do with something?
Yeah, he was, I think, a founder director of America Online, which is used for that, giant multi-level game playing activity. But also he's a former director of MGM. Right?
Well, David, I hate to do this, but we're just about out of time. We're going to have to continue this conversation during the sponsor exclusive segment, which is just about to begin in just under 10 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. You know, David, I think a lot of people are really starting to appreciate and understand the reason why we do this, because most people seem to know that whoever it is that's sponsoring the news, particularly if it's one super rich group or individual, they have influence over the reporting. And by individual viewers becoming micro sponsors, either on Reverse CSI Storyboards or Crowdsource the Truth's Patreon and Subscribestar pages, people can be resting assured that there is no outside economic influence. This is news, David, for the people, by the people, and of the people, about some crappy people who we want to hear about, but the news generally doesn't discuss. So, David, I'll see you in just a few minutes. We can dig in some more to this CAI private equity page, talk about this relationship between Yves Fortier and Oliver Buck Revell, how this could have played into the failed, let's face it, investigation into the Weather Underground. And I was so intrigued to see just 2 weeks ago that judge here in the Southern District of New York, last name Lynch. I wonder what the Black Lives Matter people will say about that. But we'll be back in just a few minutes, David. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you on Patreon and Subscribestar.
Thank you, Jason.